and trends in fiction. So if you're in the wrong room, you can scuttle out. I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to start us off with a question, but mostly I'm going to let them take it from here. And you know, if we need any extra questions, I have a bunch, but mostly you're the experts here, right? Okay, so Lauren Teffeau's novel Implanted was shortlisted for the 2019 Compton Crook Award for Best Sci-Fi Fantasy Horror Novel. Her short fiction can be found in a variety of professional and semi-pro speculative fiction magazines and anthologies. Sarena Ulibarri is a speculative fiction author and editor from the American Southwest. Her short stories have appeared in Lightspeed, Dreamforge, Giga Notosaurus, Solarpunk magazine, and elsewhere. And non-fiction essays have appeared in Strange Horizons and Grist. Her novella, Another Life, forthcoming from Stellarform Press in 2023. As an anthologist, she has curated and published several international volumes of optimistic climate fiction, Glass and Gardens, Solarpunk Summers, Glass and Gardens, Solarpunk Winters, and Multi-Species Cities, Solarpunk Urban Futures. Sarah Burr, under the name S.E. Burr, writes silly stories for children, and sometimes teaches them math at the same time, and deeply quirky books for adults. Her titles include the Math Pirate series, the Little Books of Big Choices, the YA Gobbled series, the Funny Math Stories series, and the Preemie Sibling series. By day, she works in tech support for a national laboratory. She and her husband are the parents of 2 boys. She's a long-term resident of New Mexico. Vivian Shaw was born in Kenya and has lived in Cardiff, Oxford, and Baltimore. She has a BA in art history, an MFA in creative writing and publishing arts, and currently works as a professional freelance editor and proofreader. She writes about monsters, both in and out of classic horror literature, machines, extant and fantastical, disasters and their causes, and found family. She is the author of the Dr. Greta Helsing contemporary fantasy trilogy, Strange Practice, Dreadful Company, and Grave Important. She reviews for the Washington Post, and her short sci-fi horror fiction has appeared in Uncanny and Pseudopod. Round of applause for our panelists. So I thought to get us started, for those who might be unsure, or maybe don't have a good grounding, how would you describe new genres and trends in fiction?
Let's start with what a genre is, maybe. Basically, you have the speculative umbrella, and then below that you have urban fantasy and paranormal, solarpunk, gothic fantasy, and things like that. And so it's a way of identifying to the reader maybe some expectations of what you're going to covers, and it's also a marketing tool.
Yeah, I think of genre as a collection of tropes and reader expectations. And, there's the big genre, umbrellas like science fiction. And then there's so many little subgenres within that, and we're always kind of creating new ones by combining things, and there's fantasy and the same thing, like there's primary world fantasy, there's secondary world fantasy. Does it take place in a in a world that you completely made up, or is it our world with some magic in it? And there's all kinds of things you can break and break apart, put back together, take something from here and stick it in there. So it is mostly a marketing tool, but it's a marketing tool because it's trying to bring the right readers to the work. It's about finding out the reader that wants a story like this will enjoy this, even if it kind of breaks some of the expectations. So that's kind of how I think about that genre.
In a lot of ways, I think it's sort of the professional version of the tags on AO3. So, if you happen to want to read a story about hurt comfort with this type of character and that type of character, you can go to AO3, Archive of Our Own. It's a fan fiction archive series. And you can find basically whatever story you want based on those, search string keywords. So, in a larger sense, that's what classifying something as, paranormal romance or urban fantasy or like solar punk, is going to allow the reader to be like, ah, yes, I know I want to read that because I'm gonna like at least most of the stuff in it. So it helps people like find what they want to read.
I think that different genres have different levels of expectations of what exactly it's going to be.
Yep.
For instance, mystery has very strong, like you're going to find out who did it, and hopefully it'll be a surprise. And so they all have tropes a lot. Some genres have more tropes than others, and I think, like Sarena said, there's a lot of the bigger umbrella genres and then the smaller ones, and quite often people will combine genres in new ways. I've been doing a lot of research lately about trying to figure out like the coming trends, because traditionally I've had terrible timing with what I've chosen to write. For instance, the 7th novel that I wrote, it had a major subplot that was a pandemic that somebody had created on purpose, and I finished writing the book in February of 2020. So I do tend to have very poor timing, and I'm just finishing up a book I've been writing now, and I've been starting to think about the next one, and I've been doing a lot of research on what's coming. And so one thing that I was interested to hear about was like cozy mystery, paranormal cozy mystery. So it's you know,
Sounds
the
like
cozy
fun.
mysteries with a paranormal twist. So there's lots of like intersections and combinations you can get.
It's really difficult to predict what's coming or in the timing thing, you know, because traditional publishing takes 18 months on average from the time a book is accepted, not even when it's written, when a book is accepted to when it is published. And so what you are seeing on the shelves is the trend from last year or 2 years ago, right? So by the time you see it on the shelves, it's almost already too late if you're trying to break in with that trend. So it's really difficult to know what's coming up unless you're deep in the publishing world and, you know, knowing what's being sold right now rather than what's being published right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what trends are you seeing, right? And what are the trends that you sort of you see emerging? Or, I mean, I know that I often find like 2 books released at the same time that seem to be doing the same thing, and you know that those things happened organically on their own. And it kind of kickstarts everyone talking about something. What are you seeing in your own fields and subgenres?
I think Sarah already mentioned it, the mashups. I think we've been seeing a lot of exploration of combinations of things that are maybe not what you expect. And so I think that's really interesting. And we're also seeing a lot of adaptations of things in terms of like fairy tale retellings and even some of the Greek stories that we've seen in Song of Achilles, and there's been a whole like YA glut of Greek retellings as well. So it's interesting to see these waves come and go. I know like paranormal's been declared dead, you know, horror was declared dead, and now they're coming back and more vibrant and with more diverse voices than ever. So it's really exciting to kind of see these things, and that means that you've been in the field long enough to kind of be able to track them, and that kind of comes with the territory.
Also, things come in cycles, like any fashion. Like something that's super, super hot, like right now, or like this past couple years has been like grand scale space opera. And in, I know, another couple years, probably everyone will have moved on a little bit from grand scale space opera. And then in like 15, 20 years, I'll be like, oh yeah, space opera, let's do that again. So if it will come around again, even if it's not currently like the thing on Vogue, it will probably show up again.
Trends that I've seen are like, particularly since the pandemic, like high fantasy being more popular. I think maybe as an escape, because sometimes our world isn't the most fun place to be. So that's epic fantasy, but that's also the fantasy romance over like paranormal fantasy, which would be in our world. The trend that I'm really excited about that I've seen a lot of lately is, I mentioned the paranormal cozy mysteries, but just the cozy fantasy in general without that mystery element, because I don't love mysteries because I don't like that somebody dies. I might be too cozy for the mysteries. But yeah, but just like the book Legends and Lattes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just so surprised people, and it was so wonderful. Just the best book to see this, warrior orc at the beginning kill a monster to get the good luck charm that's in its brain, but it's because she wants to open a coffee shop, and she wants to have good luck at that, and the whole rest of the book is this orc running this coffee shop, and it was just
It's delightful. Legends and lattes. It's wonderful. Yeah. I think jumping off of that, a trend that I've seen is for a long time we were deep in dystopia, right? It was all, and especially YA dystopia, so
yeah.
focused on young people. But we were so focused on dystopia and grimdark and all that. And that has really shifted. I think people are looking more for more hopeful things, more, cozier sorts of stories like Legends and Lattes, and and just visions of a better future. So I work in a genre called solar punk, which is optimistic climate fiction. So dealing with the climate crisis, but in an optimistic way. What if we change things and actually fix the world? What does that look like? But there's this sort of broader term. I'm not a big fan of it, but I'm going to introduce it here anyway. It's called hope punk. I don't know why everything's punk, but actually I do. But hope punk. So there was an Alexandra Rowland, who just on, I think it was on Tumblr or on one social media, said the opposite of grimdark is hope punk. Pass it on. That was the start of this thing, and people just really resonated with that. Of like, yes, let's have some brighter, more hopeful, stories, and it's been on a trajectory since before then. But I think that really sort of set fire to it. That people are, readers are interested in that, and I think that we're seeing more of that getting published as well. Less dystopian, not necessarily utopia, but more hopeful. And better worlds for the characters to live in, I guess.
We all kind of lived through this sort of the last few years,
Yeah.
especially in 2021 and into 2020.
Exactly, and
2020 into 2021.
absolutely, and some people want fiction that helps them process that, and so there is still an audience for the horror and the dystopia to engage with, that now that it's become more of a person's reality. There are also people who are like, that is my life. I don't want to read about that also, right? And so that's, the pendulum has swung the other way, because absolutely. I think it was already starting before the pandemic, but that, really, really pushed it. Absolutely.
So you think if McCarthy wrote the road now, it wouldn't sell?
Well,
Extreme example.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's always, nothing is ever completely dead, and you can, and, if anyone tells you, don't write this story because it won't sell, you don't need that kind of negativity in your life. Like, don't listen to that, because we never know what the next big thing is, and we never know what's going to resonate. Like, who would have thought a story about a barbarian orc opening a coffee shop would be a bestseller? Like, who knew that was what we needed? And, and there are still dystopian stories that are getting published. It's just, when something really hits with one of the big publishers especially, then they want to redo that. They're like, okay, that worked, so let's buy a bunch more that are like that. And so, that's why we got like the sort of glut of YA dystopia, because there were, the Hunger Games and Divergent and, things like that really struck. And they're like, okay, we need more like that, more like that, more like that. And it doesn't mean that all of those were successful, but, and it doesn't mean that that now that trend is over, a really good one can't still sneak through. So, you know.
Also, I think Travis Baldry, the author of Legends and Lattes, didn't he self-pub it to begin with?
He
and
did.
then one of the big publishers like woke up and was like, "Hey, this is fantastic. We want it. Let's like buy this and re-release it." And now it's like a bestseller. But
Yeah.
I like
it.
how that works sometimes these days. That you can actually self-pub something and have it make enough of an impact that enough people will sit up and pay attention, so that you might actually break through. I think, especially for something like Legends and Lattes that is basically intrinsically hopeful. That's something I want to see more of.
And I would just add to that the self-pub angle. I mean, we're seeing that being a more and more viable
Yeah.
channel.
Absolutely.
And it's like the cream rises to the tops in some cases, like in this particular case. It provides authors with a lot more control and flexibility if they don't like the traditional system. And there's also genres that are suited for that kind of model.
Mhm.
So, thinking about like your work, I think is really linked by like the term like speculative or like speculative fiction, and I'm thinking about like Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake, which is called this like dystopian novel, and she resists that because it's speculative, right? And I guess my question is like, I mean, genre is such a fluid beast. Like, does it help to draw distinctions between these things before we get to the marketing stage, right? And building on that, like, how to write in that mode and resist the spiral towards dystopia, right? I'd love to hear you each speak to the ways that your work engages and also maybe resists what we expect from that genre.
Well, just a note on Margaret Atwood. I mean, literary can be considered a genre in and of itself. It's a mode of writing.
Litfic.
So it doesn't mean it's either or. It's a part of the whole kind of thing.
I think that it can be useful to think about genre at the drafting stage, just because of those ideas of reader expectations, and also to give yourself some boundaries. But it can also be really restrictive and really constraining. So I think it's not the most important thing to think about while you're writing. The most important thing is to tell a good story.
Yeah.
And, and whether that fits into a certain genre, or whether that breaks the genre, or whether that creates a new genre, that's a decision for later on. I mean, just tell what you have to tell, and see where it goes first. And then, if you're writing a mystery and we don't find out who done it at the end, can you do that in an artful way that's not just going to get you a bunch of 1-star reviews? Because maybe you can.
I like the idea of using genre as a kind of toolbox. Like, I want to write, say, a cozy mystery. Like, now I want to do that. But that means that I need to go learn all of the aspects of what makes up a cozy mystery. Like, what kind of things exist, what don't exist, what tools do I have at my disposal that I wouldn't necessarily have writing, say, hard SFF. And then I get to play in a different sandbox than the ones that I'm used to, which is kind of exciting. But I also think that it's so easy to find yourself confined within the limits of that sandbox, especially if you're not used to it. But also, I do have to point out that a lot of what defines your book genre is not up to you. It is up to your publishers, and they may decide that they want to market as this or that or something completely over there. And then you go with it, and you have to figure out how to, navigate that. But it's not always up to you as authors.
I want to jump on something you said there about reading within the genre.
Yeah.
So something that often happens, or something I've seen, when the literary fiction writers decide to write in genre. They have not read a lot of genre. They've read plenty of literary fiction. They've read in their genre, but they decide, someone who's come up in in universities and MFA programs and, read all the literary fiction, they decide they want to write a vampire story. They're reinventing the wheel oftentimes because they haven't read the canon of vampire fiction. So they are coming up with things that they think are original and brilliant that are super cliche to anyone who knows anything about vampire fiction. So reading within, if you know you are writing in a particular genre, be familiar with that genre.
Yes.
Read widely within that genre, and then you know what's already been done. You know what the expectations are. You know what's cliche, and and then you're not reinventing the wheel. So
Also, you will look much less clueless.
absolutely,
Much
it's kind of
less.
embarrassing.
I know.
Yeah.
It's like cringe.
But, just with the creative process, I mean, you can always be surprised by what comes out at the end, or maybe not know what you're doing until you have a complete thing, and somebody says something, and you're like, oh, I didn't even think of that, and looking at it in that kind of lens.
Yeah.
And so I think that's also a really fun opportunity to kind of then go back and revise once you have those kind of markers of what you want to be aiming towards on your next revision pass. And so that can be a very invigorating moment, or it can be like, oh shit.
So I like that idea of like other people's perspectives, like informing during the process. And I know that at least two of you have experience editing,
Yeah.
right? So how does seeing other people's work change your approaches to not only your own work, but also recognize like what is new, what is surprising in the work that you're doing?
So I'm an editor. I run a small press that publishes mainly themed anthologies, and then I'm also a story reviewer for Imagine 22 Under, which is a climate fiction contest. I've read literally thousands of climate fiction short stories, and so I see some of the trends, in that, and some of the things that often newer writers will gravitate towards. So one of them, just to be give a specific example, one of them, when I'm dealing with optimistic climate fiction, solar punk, it's often takes place in kind of a new society, a new sustainable city, or a redesigned sustainable city. And so we often have the tour of the city, right? We have a stranger comes to town, right? This is
Everything's green.
Two types of stories. The stranger comes to town, or someone goes on a journey, right? Stranger comes to town, gets taken on a tour. Everything's green, everything's wonderful. Everyone's just doing their utopian chores, right? So, a lot of stories were just that, and that didn't make for a compelling story. So, in my book, I have that scene. I have a scene because it's a useful world building tool to show how the world operates. But I had all of those, examples of how it was kind of done poorly that I'd seen in the 1,000 plus stories in the slush pile, and so I was very aware of the cliche of what I was doing and tried, whether I succeeded or not is another issue. I tried to to be aware of the ways in which that trope fails, and to try to do it differently. So that's one way that reading other people's work and other people's unpublished work has really affected the way that I wrote mine.
Yeah. As an editor, a lot of the time, my job is to point out things that the author does not necessarily know they have done, but they are doing, and ask them if they want to do that. And if they don't, then help them find a way to not do those things, but keep everything else that they're doing, or shape it in a different direction. So if they're writing a story that is becoming a cliche, I'm like, okay, so I understand that you want this to do these things. How can we make it do these things while avoiding this or that? Or if you want to do this or that, that's fine. But you have to do that, deliberately with full understanding that you are in fact doing something that can be read as cliche. It's pointing out stuff that people don't necessarily know that they're doing or not doing.
That's a brilliant way to put it. Yeah.
I love editing.
Yeah, I think it's a really useful tool as a writer to read slush or to work in editing. Whether that's the school literary magazine or volunteering for Strange Horizons or something like that, because You see your own flaws reflected back to you.
So hard.
Like just again for a specific example of a cliche, like you shouldn't start a story with a character waking up, right? There are stories that pull it off, but as a general rule, don't start a story with a character waking up. Well, why? When you read all of that slush, you will see why.
Mm-hmm.
You will see it done again and again, and you'll start to understand. And so then that story that you wrote, that you're like, no, mine's the exception.
No.
You'll see maybe it's not, or maybe it is because maybe you've done it intentionally and maybe you've done it in an artful way. But I think reading other people's, not just reading published works and reading widely within your genre, but reading unpublished works and reading slush and reading reading your peers and things like that is really helpful to see if you are doing what you think you're doing in your own writing.
You can also find like little tiny errors, or not errors, but like ticks that you may not know you're doing.
Yeah.
Like you overuse the semicolon, or you use like a word 6 times in like 3 paragraphs, and you don't realize you're doing because you can't see it. It's just invisible. But if you see it in someone else's, you're like, that's really distracting. Damn. And then you have to go back and look at your own stuff.
And you don't have to, so I've never been an editor, but I've gotten and given critique a lot in creative writing classes and crit groups and just like a partner with somebody else to critique each other's stuff. And I find that I notice things in their work that I didn't realize I'm also doing in mine, and it's easier to see there's a problem in theirs. But also the great thing about like a creative writing class, for instance, here at the college, is you can hear other people give their feedback and stuff, and you can. And I found that especially helpful. When I've given a critique and other people have critiqued the same thing, the things that I didn't see in that other work, and I'm not as close to it as I would be in my own. So I feel like it's a really good growth opportunity.
Yeah, I would just say, you're publishing, if you make it to the publishing stage, you're having a lot of people you're going to be interacting with that are going to have opinions about your work. And so ways to head off some of the more common things are to get as many people on it before it gets to that stage.
Yeah.
And to kind of refine it so it's the best it can be, so that you're not dealing with these kind of more remedial issues, and you can get to that elevated prose kind of stage where it's really going to resonate with readers.
And some people think of editors as like the person that's going to come in and change everything, right? And a good editor does exactly what Vivian was saying, of like asking the reader, is this what you want to do, right? And so it's a balancing act as a, I've been on both sides. I've been the editor and I've been the edited, right? And there are things that I held strong to, like, the editor wanted me to change something, and I said, no, that means something to me. That is the word I want to use, or that is the direction I want to go with this. And a good editor is going to be like, if it's important, to them, they may push back, but eventually, if it's it's the author's story, and so a good editor is works with the author,
absolutely,
rather than against, to create the best, to push the story to be the best that it can be.
Yep.
So to take us back, like, to, I guess, the top of the session, I would love to know what trends you're seeing that you really hate. Like, what trend needs to die, essentially? Said with love, right? Everyone can write whatever they want. But which one is the one that, I don't know, for you just isn't doing it?
Or is there one that you've seen so many times that maybe isn't like negative to you, but you've just seen it so much that it may not be the best to get into, the best trend to try to run with until it goes away for a while and comes back?
Yeah.
I think my reaction to this question, it has changed since I've become a writer. Like, when I was a reader, I was, oh, I don't want to look at that. But now that I've been on the other side and I know how much time goes into this and how much is so not out in the author's control in terms of when things hit, that was somebody's baby at one point, once upon a time. And so when it hits in a cycle, mid-cycle, and people ignore it or something like that, that hurts, right?
It's sad.
And so, you know, as much as I hate, like, you know, Democrat and Republican romance, you know, which we've seen a lot of, you know, somebody spent time on that, you know, so it's for me, it's hard to kind of divorce that piece of it.
That reminded me of my answer for this. Nazi romance.
Yes.
Oh,
That
for
can
God's
die
sake.
in a
Yeah,
fire.
we don't need
and
that.
we don't need to see it ever again.
Nope.
That's
I could do with fewer things being suffixed punk.
yeah.
Like, the more you use it, the less it means, basically. The same as, like, adding core to the end of something. It no longer really has a meaning because everything is something core or something punk. Like, it'd be nice if we could come up with a more, I don't know, creative term for the thing, but
Yeah.
I'm not in charge.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, you know, I say that as one of the spokespeople of solar punk. But and some people have really resisted that term. Like, we tried to kind of adopt Kim Stanley Robinson into solar punk because we saw, you know, we being like some of the people who were originally like writing this and kind of theorizing about it. We tried to kind of fold him into it, and he didn't like the term. He rejects the term. He says, "No, I write utopian science fiction. We don't need a new term for it." And so I'm like, "Well, fine, go do your own thing." But you know, the term solar punk came kind of as an inversion of cyberpunk, and so that's why, you know, still the punk. But the term was originally used in Brazil in a trilogy of anthologies that was, let's see if I can remember them. I don't remember the actual titles, but one of them was steampunk. So, you know, and of course that's, you know, coal-powered, steam-powered, clockwork-powered,
Gears.
sort of Victorian era, you know, and then there was, so they did an anthology like that, and then there was diesel punk, which is kind of World Wars era, and, you know, gas-powered and machinery and things like that. And the editor said, well, I felt like we've polluted the literary biosphere too much. Let's see what writers can come up with that's solar punk, that's you know, renewable energy. So, you know, each of these anthologies was a type of energy: steam energy, gas energy, and then renewable energy. And they chose solar punk purely over something like in, you know, Brazilian Portuguese, it would have been like verde punk or something like that. And they said it just didn't sound as good as solar punk. So it was almost an arbitrary decision to go with that over, you know, green punk or something like that. But it was this progression, you know, and so that's why they all have the punk, you know. But then it has gotten out of hand. I agree. I agree. And now there's lunar punk, which is
sake.
like solar punk but at night, and you know. And, you know, and I published a story.
Read that now.
There's one anthology, Bioluminescent, this you know, the first lunar punk anthology that's trying to just define what is this, because both, you know, because it started just as like Tumblr vibes. It was just like people kind of posting images on Tumblr and social media and saying, you know, we like this aesthetic, and so how do you write a story with that looks like that, right? But yeah, there's too many punks. I agree.
I'm
Punk, ray punk, diesel punk, atom
Oh,
punk, cassette futurism, and cyberpunk. It's a poster that I found online.
Yeah, that's
That's a
a
lot of
partial
punks.
list. There's
Yeah, partial, I'm sure.
yeah.
I'm glad that dystopian stories are kind of trending downward. I'm glad to read more hopeful science fiction again. Just what got me excited about it in the first place, you know?
Yeah, so thinking more about like readership, how do sort of designations like middle grade, YA, adults like impact the writing process itself? And have you ever found yourself writing a project where that readership maybe changed during the process itself or even afterwards, right?
So this started, I was YA, and my agent at the time was like, your world building is super overkill for what YA readers really want. And so the solution was to age up the protagonists, and then it was in kind of fitting with what the expectations were for adult novels. And so that was I was given my marching orders essentially to change this in order to sell this book. And as soon as we changed it, it sold. So I think it's always an adventure, right? And so, you know, and goes back to my comment earlier, where sometimes you can't see what's best for your book. And it's because maybe, you know, it's lived with you for so long, you just don't have any objective kind of qualifiers anymore. And in certain writing communities, they really put an emphasis on seeing your work as a product and trying to make that shift over the course of your creative process, whether it's at the beginning, which is supposed to be like God mode, I guess. I'm not there yet. Or, you know, once you get to a point where you're ready to revise it, and revise it towards a specific kind of publishing goal, whether it's an age range or a genre kind of thing. And so it's a tool like anything else, I think, in a way to kind of view your story and to scale it appropriately.
So I think that middle grade YA adult in America is basically determined by the age of your protagonist. Like The Book Thief, I believe, was an Australian author, and he never saw that as being a young adult story or a story for people even younger. He saw it as an adult story, but his main character was a child. So it was marketed here in the US for children, and it was quite successful, but that was never his intention. And I think there are different expectations with the different age ranges, of course. Like with middle grade, nobody ever is supposed to be arrested, or, you know, just like little things like that. But at the same time, in some ways, I feel like the line between YA and adult fiction has blurred more than it was when I was reading it coming up. And there's a lot more adult themes or darker themes in YA than there once were.
I don't remember as a young adult or a teen or a kid reading stuff that was deliberately like listed as young adult. Like, I just read books, and some of them had kids as the main characters, and some of them had teens, and some of them had adults, and it never felt quite so regimented as it does now. Like, you're allowed to read in this genre, but you cannot read this genre because you're supposed to read this genre. I'm like, but they're all books. Why can't you just read the book and not care what like slot it's supposed to go into? And I think it probably does, to some extent, limit what authors can actually do if they have gotten locked into, I am writing a middle grade novel. No one can get arrested. No one can do this. I can't have these things. And that I would find that intensely claustrophobic, I think.
For years as a child, my favorite book series was the Mrs. Polyfax series, which is about a woman in her 60s and 70s who becomes a spy. And, you know, I was like 9 years old reading these. And I do think it's a little odd the way we're like so focused on
I would just say that when you're coming at it from like a teaching perspective, it's very important. And so like identifying books for readers who may be reluctant or want the graphic novels, or, you know, especially boys who drop out pretty early in terms of reading things. You know, I think those kinds of expectations are really important, but I don't think it should affect you in your early stages of your creative process.
It's interesting how, sorry to jump in, how regimented those get how regimented those get even at the library level. You know, my daughter is an avid reader. She reads above her grade level, right? Which, that's not a brag, although it sounds like it. I don't know, that's not. But at the library, they have a teen room with YA stuff. Well, she's been reading that since she was 6, right? So that's what she wants to read. But sometimes we're like, we have to look and make sure there's no teens in there, because that's their space. And we, you know, the point of that space at the library is to, so it's comforting for them, but it's also like she's not part of it. Our last summer, they had a Percy Jackson reading club, and she was like, oh, so excited because that's her favorite series. It's like, yeah, but that's for the kids who are like, you know, 14 and up. It's
Must be this tall to ride.
So it can be frustrating on that front as well, I think. I get it, but I guess to turn this into a question, be productive, not commentative. Is this more born out of marketing, right? And what does that, I mean, how is that really helping us at large, both as a reader and writer?
I do think it's driven by marketing, and I also think, libraries are kind of focused on the public, right, not individual cases, and so they know, like, this is for somebody who has trouble with parsing text, right, or, this is for somebody who is, hyperlexic or something like that. So a good librarian will, identify these eager readers and support them, because what you're also talking about is a community issue, right, where she doesn't have her own community to kind of share this process with. And so there are steps that can happen at the library level. My background is in libraries in a weird way. And so, but it comes from the staffing and it comes from the funding.
The funding, yeah.
And so without that, then you're going to get more cookie cutter kind of services, because that's how the system is kind of created.
I think possibly it also has something to do with the gathering air of censorship, like what you're allowed to read, what you are not allowed to read because you're like not old enough to ride this particular ride. It's the more things get put into little boxes, the more you can restrict who gets to do what. And I think that is a thing that has been increasing over the past decade, and I don't know what, if anything, can be done about it, since it has its roots in like society as opposed to like, I don't know, teaching.
I'm gonna make you mad. So I actually got in an argument with our librarian, because my daughter also was reading in the teen section when she's like, 10 or 11, and I was pre-reading the books because I would get YA novels just sometimes to read, and I was surprised at what they were putting in there. There was one that I had read, and it was way more graphic than 50 Shades of Grey. And it was about like child prostitution, like underage minors, and they go into detail, and he's like, this boy is like being abused by men, even though he's not attracted to men, just because he wants to make money, and like it goes into graphic detail, and it's in the YA section. And so I went and asked the librarian, and I was like, why don't y'all put some kind of warning for parents who don't realize that there is content like this in there, just so that the parents know? Because my daughter's like, 10. And she's like, well, we can't. That's censorship. I was like, but if you're not telling people not to, but you're just letting parents know because they're expecting this is for a certain age group, they may not be aware. She's like, no, it's censorship. And I do think as parents, you should be guardians for what your children are exposed to, because there is a right age for certain things, because they don't know until they know. And then I've had other, you're around children who are exposed to certain things, and then they show up and are telling your children things. I do think there should be boxes checked, not until someone is a certain age, like, because you have to protect innocence up to a certain degree.
So you're a quarter case, right? There's tons of other people in your library system who are using it the way they should, right? The way that it is expected to be used and engage in this material. So because you're a corner case, I think you're running into these kinds of issues. If your kid was reading at grade level, would you have these same kind of reservations?
Well, I mean, talking about like genres and like what's expected for a children's or an adolescent's, and kind of like having stipulations of what should go into a genre, I can see that, because then as a parent, okay, if they're reading a middle grade book, it's not going to have child prostitution. So I don't need to pre-read all these books that she's reading, because I know that won't be in there. But if you don't, if you're okay with your kid reading that stuff, then they can go into another section, so just sometimes as a parent, when you've got, you know what to expect. And it doesn't mean that a child can't read those books if you want them to, but then you kind of know, okay, it's like if I'm reading a romance or watching a chick flick and I don't feel like seeing, mass murder, I know going into that I'm not going to see it.
So I would also say the library is maybe not the place to get that information. That's where the reviewing kind of apparatus is best served. What's in a book, right? So when you read book reviews, you'll see that, oh, this is a spicy romance, or this is a very sweet romance, or there's bestiality, or whatever, trigger warnings. I mean, we're seeing more of that just in the marketing copy and things like that. But we also have a very the review system is broken in a lot of ways, and it's complicated. But because we don't have a really robust review system, I think you're kind of maybe missing some of that information, which is not necessarily the library's place to provide. That stuff you could find at Goodreads or online and that kind of thing.
I was just talking about expectation within genre, and that's where I see it to be useful and not like a censoring, because you're not being stopped for reading adult books, but as a parent, if they're reading middle grade, then they're not experiencing adult content.
I think that's a good assumption that middle grade you're not going to see the child prostitution that you mentioned earlier. I think that's a fair, that's a reasonable expectation. I can't say it's absolutely true, but I think that's a reasonable assumption to make about middle grade. YA has a lot more latitude, and it's very much book by book by book, and that's where I think the reviews can help you kind of identify. Oh, honey, maybe not that one today.
Oh, she's past that. She's almost a college.
My daughter had the same kind of issue that when she was 10, her reading was doing kind of dwindling, and she'd started reading early and found books she was interested in. But at 10, you're looking at, we're starting to kind of look at Harry Potter, and we had tried to read Secret Garden and some other things, and she just wasn't interested. And then my mom just bought her this book at Walmart. It was called The Obsession, I think, and it was pretty much older, I would say. And I didn't really know anything about it, but my mom gave it to her, so I thought, this be fun. And then later on, Kylie's telling me about the book, and I was like, oh, I'm not sure about this book, but we talked about it, in such, and I talked to her about, in terms of movies, when she was little, she was afraid of monster movies, and we talked about special effects, and we watched some videos on YouTube about special effects, and she wasn't so scared of it, and so we kind of talked through things. But she read that book, and she loved it, and she loves suspense and thriller. And then she went from there, I think, to Good Girls Guide books and some other things. And she was reading for an older, what I would say was probably an older crowd, but that's what she liked. She wanted to read that things her age were not interesting, or we didn't find anything interesting at her age.
How many people in here read a book that they were not prepared to read at an early age? I think it's just a risk of a literate society, to be honest.
I think the best part is when you're reading it when you're young, and then you don't really get it. But you're like, okay, that's cool, that's cool. And then you get older, and you're like, hey, I remember this one book that was kind of weird. Maybe I should read it again. And you read it, and you're like, whoa. Oh, that's why I didn't get it. But then it's cool because then you get opened up to read at different ages and different stations in your life, and it's like. Just it prepares you for finding things again, and then also going down that route again. And so I think it's awesome the way YA has gone, mainly because me being younger, I grew up in a very poor community, and we didn't have a lot of money, but then reading these books that also connected that and connected to people that had lives that were like mine, then I was able to connect it on that level. And I might not have been able to fully understand, but then rereading it as an adult, you connect to it even more, and it carries on with you. And I think that's what books are supposed to do, is carry on with us throughout our lives, whether we remember it page by page or just remember the way it makes us feel. That's the importance of it.
I'd love to open us up to any other questions that we have for our panelists. Anyone?
So I want to talk about new genre, right? And how much of a wave of the genre is a result of more openness to different people writing in that genre, or adjacent to it?
I mean, I think just at a systemic level, at the big publishers and things, there's been a uneven, but over the last couple of years, a push for more diversity and inclusion, and at both the staffing level and also at the publishing, and then also in terms of their authors as well. And so while, it's not perfect by any stretch and it's not nearly enough, we are seeing more and more voices that have not been as well represented in the past. And I think that's the net positive, even if it's kind of ugly getting us to that point.
And I think one thing that happens with when we are hearing these new voices, they're telling stories from, the perspective of their culture maybe, and American marketing doesn't know what to call that.
Yeah.
And so maybe they create a new label or a new genre, or try to, define it as a mashup of several known genres to try to appeal to, to an English-speaking audience, to explain a story that's outside of, their experience, but isn't necessarily anything new to the person who wrote it, because it came, out of their culture. So, yeah, I'm thinking like magic realism is a good example of that, right? Which is, primarily written by, people from like, the global South, and especially South America and Mexico, and yeah, like American publishers didn't know what to do with that, but it was doing something really interesting and something really unique from, from their perspective. So we created this label that, mashes up a couple things.
I think if you want to read, if you're looking to read broadly and to get a sense for different people, different places, I think it's really, one thing you can do is read books in translation.
Definitely.
Because I think that English is, I think it's a real, it's I think easier for people who are native English speakers to get published, but there's so many of voices and so many books that are so amazing. I've read some really wonderful books in translation, and now I've gone blank. But yeah.
I mean, one book that I read in translation recently was called The Route of Ice and Salt, I think, something like that, which it's written by a queer Mexican author, and it was just recently translated into English, and it's Dracula, but from the point of view of the ship captain who transported Dracula to England. And it is very lyrical, it is very queer, it is very different than any other like Dracula retelling I've ever seen. So that's one example.
That's awesome.
And it also depends on the translator. I mean,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
think of the Iliad, right? We know, or the Odyssey. We know what those stories are, right? Well, they've all been written by white, Western-educated men. And recently we had our first female translation of that by Emily Wilson. And it's completely different. There's so much more nuance to the stories, and things that we assumed were maybe, all the men, but maybe there were women mixed in because she translated Latin in a different way than was, assumed by her predecessors. So I think it's really, you need to have a healthy skepticism, I think, and kind of have and maybe be a little more aware of some of these processes that are happening behind the apparatus. I don't know, that doesn't make sense, but
It sort of does. See, also Maria Davana Headley's translation of Beowulf,
Yes.
which came out, 2 years ago? Something like
that
that?
sounds right.
Recently, and there's a lot of controversy about the way she opened it, because basically I think she started with like, yo, as opposed to like the equivalent of now I will tell this story. It's like, yo, let me tell you this amazing story. It was such a sort of groundbreaking way to set aside all of the tradition of how people have translated this particular piece and just sort of look at the piece in a modern or contemporary light and like see what it would be like if somebody was telling that story today as opposed to when it was originally written. I love that. I found it like one of the most approachable, but also one of the most enjoyable Beowulfs I've read since Seamus Heaney, basically.
And linguistically, she's right.
Yeah. I mean, this is the other great thing is none of the choices she made are unsupported, and I love that. Mhm.
And nobody realized it until some English scholars read the, I think, the preface and realized this is not Dracula.
How strange.
Because nobody
Yeah,
ever
it's a
translated
weird
it
book.
back
It's
into
great.
English. Quite interesting.
It explains some things about Iceland.
A couple other translation shout-outs. So within Solarpunk, the optimistic climate fiction I work with, I mentioned those 3 Brazilian anthologies that kind of started this genre. My small press hired a translator to translate that last one, that Solarpunk one, into English, so that it could be part of the conversation about what this genre is, and so that those stories didn't get left behind because they weren't in English. And so it's just called Solarpunk. Ecological and fantastical stories in a sustainable world is the long subtitle. But and I commissioned that sight unseen because I don't read Portuguese. So I was like, I don't know if these stories are any good. I don't know if they fit what we're talking about Solarpunk being. And the answer is kind of no. Because they're very focused on the renewable energy part of it, and they're not all optimistic. Some of them are like, green tech is also evil, because it's still a corporation, right? So, but I didn't want them to get left behind because they weren't in English. So we kickstarted that. We brought it into English. And then another anthology I edited, Multi-Species Cities, which I think they have a couple copies of at the table outside. We have 2 stories translated from Japanese, which was a really, that's pretty rare. And they're short stories. They're really interesting, strange, to me, stories, but they really added something new to the anthology. The anthology would really be incomplete without them. I think those are the only translations from Japanese. And then there's one more that's about to come out, Francesco Verso, who has been one of the big international proponents of Solarpunk. He himself has translated a bunch of stuff into Italian or into Portuguese. His first novel is being translated into English. I believe it's called The Walkers. And so that's one of the first big Solarpunk optimistic climate fiction examples from Italy that's finally coming to an English-speaking audience. So Francesco Verso is the author.
This is not the same topic, but I think we're almost done. There was something that I just found out this week that I was so excited about in terms of trends that I hadn't known. So I just wanted to tell you guys. So if you go to imdb.com and you have to type in /search and then /title, I probably should have known this, but you can select the genre and put the dates in the future, and you can see all the movies that are being planned to come out for the next several years. And to me that's really exciting because a lot of times with Bridgerton, you got a jump in people wanting to read Regency, and that often happens. So I was very excited about that, and I just thought I'd share it.
So you can see how many Marvel movies are coming.
Vampires are back, with Renfield and a couple other things like that, and what we do in the shadows. I mean, that's cool again, and that was dead,
Yeah, but vampires come back from the dead. That's kind of their thing.
Yeah, it's sort of thematically consistent.
Right,
I
but
have a novella coming out that's vampire-centric, probably the end of this year.
Yeah, and there was a time when you could not sell a vampire novel.
I was amazed that I sold mine.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Although, that was, and again, that's for the big presses, would not touch vampire, but that didn't mean there wasn't still an audience for it.
People still like it.
Yeah, and so vampire fiction just moved to the small presses and to the self-published, and they were still selling. So, but yeah, it's back for sure.
Hit the zeitgeist for once.
Yeah, it goes back to that cycles, right? Nothing ever dies for good. It's just, can you give a fresh perspective on it? Can you update those tropes for the audience of today and not the audience of 20 years ago?
Just simple things. Update everything.
Yeah, just
do better.
That's all you do.
So we have to wrap up, but thank you so much. If we want to give a round of applause.